Hello, Christian ethics class, and welcome to the online portion of our lecture for this week. Last week, we began our discussion of good relationships, and we talked about the question of friendship and why friendship is a foundational category for talking about relationships, and then we talked about marriage generally and sexuality generally. This week, we are going to dig into the topic of homosexuality. And as we know, this is one of the very divisive and difficult topics in the church today. It is a phenomenon that has really come to the fore in our culture in the global north, certainly here in the United States and North America. It is an issue that has been part of our legal framework, and as you know, the U.S. Supreme Court has recently decided that gay marriage is a constitutional right, and this was a very hotly contested and difficult issue and remains a difficult issue for us. So we're going to look at it through a number of lenses. We're first going to talk about the science of homosexuality, or at least the best understanding that we have today of the science relating to homosexuality. We're then going to talk about the scriptural context that we have to look at as people trying to do Christian theological ethics relating to homosexuality. We're then going to talk about the natural law tradition and the traditional view kind of within the church about this topic. Then we'll look at some revisionist views and the positions that some people take today in arguing that these certain kinds of homosexual practice are not necessarily outside the bounds of Christian life and church life and conduct. And then we'll look at some responses to those revisionist views. I am not in this lecture intending to take a specific position. When we meet together, I will talk to you a bit about what my own views are at this point. I hope that what you do see in this lecture is that there are some difficulties to this question. There are some subtleties to this question. Theologically and exegetically, there are some subtleties to this question. I hope you will see that the traditional position is not a sort of fundamentalist position in and of itself. It has some sound grounding in Scripture and in some natural law thinking and in the tradition as a whole. I hope you will also see that the revisionist position is not just entirely made up either, but that it is an effort to think through something that is facing us and that is pastorally and culturally difficult for us today. I hope at the end of all this discussion, you will be able to articulate and develop your view in the context in which you minister in a very thoughtful and faithful way as you understand what Scripture requires and as you understand what God requires. And I hope you will also be able to live that out pastorally in the context in which you minister in a way that is humble and gentle and faithful, whatever your position on this issue is. So, with all of that, let us look first at our understanding of the scientific issues around homosexuality. And I am not myself a scientist, so like anyone else who isn't a scientist or who isn't working in a specific discipline, I need to rely as best I can on what seems to be the best science that's being done in a given area. Now, the fact that you're not a scientist doesn't mean that you can't do some evaluation of what the scientific perspectives are. It doesn't mean you need to uncritically accept everything that the scientific establishment is saying. But I do believe, and if you take my class on theology and science, I'll go into these perspectives a little bit more. I do believe that Christian theology needs to do its best to try to understand the best scientific knowledge that we have available and to try and incorporate that and deal with that in our efforts to understand better our theological positions. I don't think it's appropriate for Christian theology to have its own alternative science. I don't think it's appropriate for Christian theology to simply ignore or dismiss the best science of the day. I do believe that the scientific enterprise is one that is engaged in an effort at philosophical realism, and I think philosophical realism is important to Christian theology. We believe creation is real and has an existence and has a givenness to it because of how God created it, and because of that, that means that it has a regularity that we can study. That also doesn't mean we need to accept all of the philosophical presuppositions of modern science. I think there are some philosophical aspects of naturalism, certainly, that are very much mistaken. But we can reject naturalism without rejecting realism. In fact, I think to adopt a posture of realism, you really have to reject a rigid kind of naturalism. All of that is to say, I think we need to try to take the best scientific literature that is available and to try and understand it. And I think this is really difficult in a few hot-button areas, including this area of homosexuality, because there have been, I think, some advocacy groups and other people within the church, within a Christian context, who've been trying to advance claims that are supposedly based on science that are really not based on very good science or on very good research or reasoning. So, what is the very best science that is available to us? It does seem that sexual orientation has a genetic component. There are a number of studies that do suggest that people who experience homosexual orientation, on the whole, have some differences in some of their genetic makeup. So it is fair to say that, broadly speaking, and when we talk about things like this, you really aren't necessarily looking at any one particular case or saying that this is necessarily true in every individual case, but you're looking at kind of a distribution of findings, and you're saying kind of on the whole in this distribution of findings, this is a fair conclusion. So sexual orientation does have a genetic component. At the same time, it's really inaccurate to speak of a gay gene, and I think most geneticists and other researchers really seriously working in this field would agree with this. This is not a contrarian claim about the science, but it's just a statement about what we really can say about the science of genetics. Genes affect our behaviors. Genes don't, in an absolute sense, control all of our behaviors. Genes are expressed within the body and affect our makeup, obviously our physical makeup, and affect our emotional makeup, but they don't necessarily determine it. So sexual orientation does have a genetic component. It's really inaccurate, however, to speak of a gay gene that determines absolutely sexual orientation. Environment and culture do affect human behaviors, including our sexual behaviors. So the kind of family we are raised in, the kind of culture we are raised in, what our culture perhaps permits, what our culture perhaps requires to be kept under wraps, are all going to affect in complex ways sexual behaviors. So it is fair to say that if a person is experiencing same-sex attraction, homosexual orientation, that there's likely to be an aspect of their culture, of their background, of their upbringing that interacts in complex ways with their genetic makeup, and that in some way does affect their outlook and their behaviors. It is inaccurate, however, to suggest that all or most gay people have suffered from abuse or have suffered from deficiencies of upbringing. There, has been and continues to be some groups that oppose homosexuality in a very strong way, some of them Christian or other religious groups that try to come out with studies suggesting that in large part homosexual orientation is the result of childhood abuse. And that's simply not true. Those studies are that come forward from those groups in large part have been debunked and are not really very well supported in the scientific literature. Now, that is not to say that confusion about sexuality, that difficulties in sexual behaviors can't or don't have roots in things like abuse or difficulties when someone is young. Certainly, those kinds of things affect us as we grow older, and they can affect our sexuality. And certainly there are people who are experiencing difficulties or confusion about their sexuality that has at least some roots in that kind of experience when they're younger. But it is not true to say that, on the whole, homosexual orientation is the result of childhood abuse. There are also studies suggesting that there are meaningful differences in the brains of gay people compared to straight people. Differences in the way the brains respond, differences even in the structure of the brain. Now, we have to be careful with this. Again, these are kind of limited numbers of studies showing some tendencies, some overall trends. It doesn't mean that any one given gay person has a particular kind of brain or something like that. We also have to be careful about this because there is not a suggestion here that the brains of gay people are in some way grossly abnormal or damaged or something like that. They're simply differences. There are a variety of differences that we can look at in people's brains that do have relationships to various kinds of characteristics and behaviors and other sorts of things, not necessarily antisocial ones. So, differences in the way we reason, the way we process information, differences in the kinds of intelligences we have, a whole variety of things that we don't associate with any kind of abnormality, simply, differences across a statistical curve, so to speak. Of course, there also are people who have suffered brain damage, and we, suffered a condition that we would define as brain damage that can severely affect their behaviors. But that is not what we're talking about here. We're simply talking about some relatively subtle but real differences in some of these studies. People may have differences in brain chemistry that relate to all sorts of capacities or functionalities of their personality, of their biology, and so on, but it doesn't mean that all of their behaviors are determined. But I have to say that this is a hotly contested area in neuroscience and in the philosophy of mind. Part of my doctoral work relates to the philosophy of mind, neuroscience, and theology. There are neuroscientists who would argue that all of our behaviors, all of our thoughts, all of our intentions are indeed determined by neuroscience. And there are some philosophers of biology and philosophers of mind who would agree with that. I don't agree with that. I don't think that's a mainstream philosophical position. Certainly from the perspective, I would argue, from any kind of ethical thought, certainly from the perspective of any kind of Christian theological ethics, there's an element of intentionality and rationality and will, however our brain chemistry affects us, that we have some agency over, some freedom over. I just want to note it. It's a hotly disputed area. But in any event, I have not seen an argument that suggests that brain chemistry absolutely determines sexual behaviors. There is no evidence that surgery, brain surgery, drug therapies, or any other form of conversion therapy can really change a person's sexual orientation. There are, of course, groups out there, some of them, many of them religiously affiliated, many of them affiliated with Christian organizations, that try to suggest that some kind of conversion therapy, perhaps involving drugs, perhaps involving some kind of spiritual warfare, perhaps involving other kinds of conduct, would be able to change a person's fundamental orientation from homosexual to heterosexual. And there simply is no evidence that this is the case or that any of these therapies really work. And in fact, there is some substantial evidence that these kinds of treatments can really be psychologically and spiritually damaging. So obviously my perspective on these kinds of things is that they're really, whatever we ultimately think about the ethical issue, whatever we ultimately think about how the church ought to respond to the question of homosexuality in our culture, my perspective would be that this kind of approach is really not the appropriate approach. Okay, so this is a general overview of sort of the scientific perspectives on things, and as I've said, I do believe it reflects the best scientific understanding that we have available to us today. And I think that however we're going to think through this issue, these basic realities, these basic reflections of the facts are things that we need to be able to take into account